talking, yeah, just talking about well-being and how we are thinking about well-being and how we are sort of framing this narrative. And then the second part would be more about creating the data set to sort of answer the questions that we set up in the first part. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what we've been up to and some initial results and insights into the data. So yeah, so feel free to stop me at any point if something looks interesting or not. So yeah, so this is the big framework that I think all of us are sort of aware of. So we are primarily focused on the consumption from a household perspective and thinking about how that is related to both the energy demand and as well as well-being at the household level. So I'll just focus on this particular block here and just keep the discussion and results and literature, everything focused on this, but everything else is happening outside this little window. And what I'll do is I'll break down each one of these different chunks and see what is in there and how do we make the connection between energy consumption and well-being. So the first part is just looking at consumption and how we want to think about consumption at the household level. And the way this is typically done in most surveys is looking at different household expenditure categories. So here, for example, there's a ton of different categories going all the way from food expenditures to education to air travel. And what you see here in each little block is with household income, how does the expenditure on a particular category vary? And if we're to focus on a couple of things here, we can already understand a lot about lifestyles. So on the top left here, we see how expenditure on food spending at home changes. So we see that the expenditure sort of slows down with increasing income. And another extreme example is jewelry, for example, where you almost see that there's an exponential increase in spending on jewelry as you make more money. So there's a lot of literature out there just digging into these trends and understanding how people would spend their money. And the next question is, how do you connect these expenditure categories to energy demand? And again, there is a lot of work in this area as well, just making this connection through various economic transaction models. So what you would do is you take the expenditure numbers from each household and then link that to different economic sectors, and then you do a global transaction and see how much does a particular expenditure category contribute towards your energy footprint. And typically what is observed is that there is a pretty strong linear correlation. So as you're spending more, your energy footprint keeps on increasing. But the more interesting question, the more interesting question is which categories actually contribute towards this footprint and which do not. So if you have to break these expenditure categories down and see which ones contributing more and which ones contributing less, you'd end up with a chart like this. So on the y-axis, you have the elasticity, and on the x-axis, you have the energy intensity per dollar. And the size of the circles represents the fraction of contribution towards a household's expenditure. So people spend a lot of money, relatively speaking, on heat and electricity, and that is also the biggest contributor in terms of energy intensity. And similarly, you could map out different categories in different parts of this map here. But what?
Okay.
Yeah, go on.
I have a question about this measure of energy intensity. Megajoules per dollar.
Right.
So, It also feels like a measure of efficiency of spending efficient, like for every dollar spent, you're getting more megajoules out of it. Is that
Correct.
a useful way to think about it too, or not? Maybe not. I'm just trying to figure out.
Well, for every dollar spent, it generates the most energy, I guess, if that's how I would think about it.
Okay.
If I can jump in, I mean,
Okay.
very often the dollar is providing a different kind of service.
Right.
So it wouldn't be comparable in terms of thinking about it as an efficiency, because then you're holding the service constant.
Okay, that's where I'm
Right.
getting hung up. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is looking across different services and just wondering, which ones are requiring the most amount of energy per dollar spent, which is under the assumption that people can choose how to spend their money and do so in a manner that maximizes their well-being. So let's find out what's most energy intensive from those.
Among those expenditures. Okay.
Yeah.
I think what you just said helped it click for me that I don't assume that the energy service provided is equivalent. So
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That's why the efficiency wasn't working for me, but now I got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Narsima. Yeah, and what this does not tell us is, what are people actually getting out of, heat and electricity spending? So the way I started thinking about this is, what does this spending or energy generation actually represent? So we could think about this in two different ways. One is just a bunch of different objective indicators for what this spending represents. So this could be spending on appliances in the house, specifically for space heating or improving your house quality, and a bunch of other things that actually represent what you're getting out of this. Or on the other hand, it could be spending in order to avoid certain circumstances. So you're paying money so that you're not feeling cold, or you're setting your house at the right temperature. And we can think about these indicators for every single category here. Like, what is it that you're actually deriving out of this spending? And more importantly, is this contributing to your well-being or not? And that begs the question, what is well-being? So we'll take a step backwards and first understand well-being, and then circle back to this question about expenditure and well-being. So subjective well-being, at least in psychology literature, has been mostly categorized into three different ways. So you could have hedonic well-being, which is just your everyday reactions to things that happen. So these would be based on a prompt such as, did you smile at all yesterday? Were you worried yesterday? And evaluative, which is probably the most studied in literature, which is a ladder score of 1 to 11, and you rate your life on average, everything considered, and then that would be your score. And there are other aspects as well, such as your purpose, your meaning in life, which would all fall into the eudaimonic category. And it's pretty well established at this point that these could have different behavior with income. So for example, the ladder, which is the dotted line here, which is the evaluative kind, typically increases with increasing income. But the other kinds, which are sort of bundled up into this economic well-being, usually plateau off with income. So this sort of tells us that we might have to treat these differently, and again, based on the kind of analysis we want to do. And this particular example is all based on income. So you have trends of well-being with income. But if you want to actually think about how people consume things, you want to think about well-being in terms of expenditure. So trying to, again, make the connection between consumption and well-being. So similarly, there have been other studies looking at the connection between household expenditure and life satisfaction. And generally, similar to income, expenditure is also positively and significantly contributing to life satisfaction. But the bigger question here again is which particular category drives well-being, and are there categories that do not either drive negatively or do not even contribute towards well-being. So here,
Sorry, can I ask another question?
yes.
I am curious about that adjusted R-squared. Is that for the overall OLS regression?
That is for the overall regression, yes.
Okay. Explaining life satisfaction as the dependent variable.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
And yeah, I want to point out one specific example from the literature that does this breakdown of different household expenditure categories and looking at their correlation to life satisfaction. And this particular study looks at Europe, so different parts of Europe. And here are the data points, just looking at Eastern European countries. So this would be considered countries that are transitioning into development, so slightly on the poorer side. And what they found is that utility expenditure, just heat and electricity, contributes quite significantly and positively to life satisfaction. And as you sort of travel across Europe, going through center and the most developed countries, which would be France and Germany, what they see is that the contribution that utilities has actually goes on decreasing and becomes insignificant by the time you get to the more developed parts. So this sort of prompted me to think about how utilities might actually change with different levels of income, especially in the context of the US. And maybe we would see something similar if you were to slice down the populations into different buckets, and maybe there are households where utilities doesn't contribute and otherwise. So that was sort of the beginning to sort of lay down the questions that we would be interested in is, yeah, the first one is just looking at how and what consumption categories would contribute to well-being across the income distribution in the US. And then more specifically, are there certain services or goods whose lack of in the house might contribute to well-being. So for example, if you don't have an AC or if you don't have a working refrigerator, I don't think that's legal. Does that decrease your well-being? And how do all of these change with life circumstances that you find yourself in? So for example, if you're working 2 jobs or if you have X number of children, so do these things change with those characteristics? And the way we wanted to address this was using existing survey data. So I'll just pause here briefly. I just want to look at the chat because we'll be going into the second section. So I'm just going to look at the chat.
I think that one study you showed, the R-squared was so low. Just wondering, expenditure matters, but seems to matter so little. I'm just wondering if that's a generalizable result in terms of the overall explanatory power.
I think it is pretty generalizable. I think all the studies that I've seen, maybe 0.1, 0.2 is probably the tops. I mean, also because, yeah, there are so many things that don't go in there. So your social time, your lot of social factors, which do add to life satisfaction, but are not used in the regression study. So I feel the goal is not to explain life satisfaction as much as it is to just look at the contribution of expenditure towards life satisfaction. So, I mean, I feel you could inflate it by just including a lot of health factors and a lot of social factors, but yeah. Okay, then I'll just get into the second part, which Yeah, Adam, you're right. Yeah. So yeah, so our central sort of theme is just looking at subjective well-being, and we wanted to use the Gallup survey for this. And everything else we look at would be sort of from a well-being lens. So we wanted to use some energy-related variables from the REX survey, and then looking at a bunch of housing and food variables from the AHS, which is the housing survey. And then we want to look at some health expenditures from the expenditure survey. And also this lot of nutritional insecurity, which we wanted to treat slightly differently from just food insecurity. So that comes from the food APS study. And then finally looking at transportation insecurities coming from the NHTS. So this is a broad framework, and each of these surveys, has a bunch of variables that we have to dig through to find out, what exactly is interesting. So,
Karthik,
and
can
yeah.
I just half question, half comment here?
Mhm.
It seems that the finding that expenditure is not contributing a lot to subjective well-being overall in terms of explaining life satisfaction doesn't necessarily imply that deprivations also would not then matter, because the deprivations are not really being counted in a way in those studies. It could be that they are having a disproportionate impact on those few that have deprivations. So I'm just trying to, just thinking aloud, that the fact that expenditure is not contributing a lot to life satisfaction doesn't undermine the question about whether the deprivations are limiting well-being. Is that
Right.
correct to think of it that way?
That is correct. And also because those are average in the sense that you use the whole income distribution, right? So if you were to slice it up, so you would definitely find that on the lower end, there is more contribution than at the higher end. So yeah. All right, yeah. So now we're getting into the fusion ACS part. So this might be quite similar to the presentation that I did earlier, but I've added in a few more details for just for more clarity. So yeah, so the way we are approaching this is using this data platform where we fuse all the surveys that I had showed you onto the American Community Survey. And the key idea here being, how might have these respondents answered questions from these other surveys? Might being crucial because what we do is probabilistic. So all the numbers we see have some sort of probability associated with them. And I also talk about how we deal with this probability approach. So the way we do this is, I'll just give you an example for one particular survey, and the same approach is sort of used for all the surveys that I showed you earlier. So all the surveys that we are interested in, we sort of call them as donor surveys. And here is an example, just looking at how we would do the fusion for REX to ACS. So the first step would be to clean up all the surveys. So this is perhaps the most labor intensive part, where you would, thanks Narasimha. Yeah, so this is just to clean up all the surveys so that all of them are consistent in the way we deal with missing values, the way certain common variables are defined. So once we clean up the surveys, the first step would be to identify variables that are common between our donor survey and our ACS survey. So for example, here we have a bunch of variables that are sort of common between REX and ACS. And the way we do the matching, I'll just walk you through an example. So here we're just looking at how we would match a household income variable. So for the REX survey, household income is reported in these different buckets. But for the ACS survey, household income is a continuous variable. So what we do is then we create this bin breakpoints here so that we can break up the household income into similar categories that are present in Rex. And then when we do the matching group by group based on the buckets we've developed. And we do this for every single variable that is common across these two surveys. So once we've identified the common variables, we train our potential fusion, the variables that we are interested in. That is this harmonizing step. And then once we've trained that data, then we do a probabilistic matching between the donor and the ACS survey. So once we are done with this matching process, at the end, this is what a final result would look like. So we would have all the variables in the ACS survey, and tagged on to that would be the fused variable. And we have multiple copies here. The reason for having these multiple copies is to capture the underlying uncertainty in this probabilistic process. So to give you an example, for example, if there's a question in the Rex survey asking about whether you had an AC or not, and the answer is yes or no, but a probabilistic model would say there's a 0.8%, 0.8 or 80% chance that somebody would say yes, and 20% that somebody would say no. So that uncertainty is sort of captured in these 40 copies. So if you were to average out, you would get 80 yeses and 20 nos. So all the analysis that we do is across these 40 copies, and then means and any other final parameters are also reported based on these 40 copies. And the first step.
Karthik, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you hear me? So how much does this imputation depend on you identifying the variables that connect, or is it simply probabilistic so that within I guess I'm trying to figure out.
Well, it does depend completely on how good the matching process is. And I'll
so you're sharing these characteristics, but it's your definition of what the characteristics are that really that probably dominates the ability to share the rest of the data across from one survey to another. Is that right?
But I don't think I got the question. So it does depend on, well, the way we do the matching. Is that what you're implying?
Yeah, something like that. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you choose shared characteristics for fusion, but if there was a different set of characteristics that were shared, then you would get a different answer, right?
Well, that is correct, but there is a way to sort of validate what we produce. So yes, you would get a different answer if you had a different set of matching characteristics, but there is a way to check how good the matching process is. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the limitations. Okay, thanks.
So yeah, even during the matching process, there is a small level of subjectivity because sometimes variables could be slightly differently defined. So you do have to go in there manually to sort of tweak them a little bit, but yeah.
Can I just add one comment, Karthik, if you don't mind?
Mm-hmm.
It also depends on the nature of the data. So certain variables like electricity consumption are so strongly influenced by climate and income, for example. You can't just mechanically say the more matching variables you have, the better your estimates. It depends on what data. So yeah, but in any case, the validation process shows you how good your estimations are.
Right. So the validation process. So the way we run the validation process is, I'll just walk you through this example here. So there is the median absolute percent error on the y-axis, and there is the subset size on the x-axis. So we take the fusion data and we slice it in different ways, different sizes, and then we calculate, in this case, the means, and then compare the means to what it was in the original survey. And then we see how different those two numbers are. So for example, here, we look at electricity consumption, even for a subset size of 0.1%, the error is around 5% compared to what it was in the original survey, and then this decreases. But yeah, other variables such as propane consumption or fuel oil, which again, to begin with, are quite sparse because there's a lot of zeros in the original survey. So I think this is sort of what Nasim was hinting at. So if the quality of the original variables in the original survey is not good, then regardless of how good or bad our matching processes, which see pretty high errors, especially on the lower end. But once we have, if you're working with full set, then our errors for most of the variables are under 5%. And this is the new Rex, this is Rex 2020. And just to give you a sense of what we were working with previously, which is the Rex 2015 survey. And if you were to compare, let's say for a subset size of 2.5%, the insecurity variable, for example, has maybe 3% error in the 2020 sample, but in the older version is around maybe 7 or 8%. So again, so 2 points here. One, well, the smaller we slice, the uncertainty is going to increase. But if we have more data points in the original data itself, then that decreases our error bars as well. So, and we would run this validation process for all the different surveys that I talked about. And this is just internal validation. Another way to sort of check or just have a sense of how good our variables are is to do external validation. So this would be comparing our simulated data to what is out there. So here is an example, just looking at electricity consumption. On the y-axis is our simulated data, and on the x-axis, our real data coming from utility companies. And then we see, a pretty good correlation at the county level. And finding data sources is difficult for this external validation, just because the whole point of creating the data was because data doesn't exist at this scale. So here is another example looking at simulated energy insecurity versus the number of calls that people make in Philadelphia asking for heat or energy assistance. And we do see a positive correlation here. And again, there's a lot that is sort of hidden in these plots because, for example, the people who are making calls, why are people making calls? Who are the people not making calls? So there's a lot to sort of unravel here, but at least the positive correlation is, slightly comforting. And this external validation, again, wherever data is available, we'll try to do this for all the other surveys as well, but this is just an example for Rex. So at the end of the day, this is what our final data set looks like. So we have a lot of socio-demographic variables coming from our base community survey, and then we have tagged along all the different interesting variables coming in from these specialized surveys as well. So now the big question is which variables to pick and what do we think actually contributes towards well-being and consumption. And so, yeah, so then we get to this final part of actually figuring out what is well-being and what contributes towards it. So I'll just map out everything we have, or the way I've been thinking about this, and then I'd love to hear some reactions. So yeah, so these are the different well-being types that we talked about previously. And a way to think about this, as we saw, was just looking at different consumption categories and then just linking that to well-being. And what we also saw is that what might be actually contributing towards people's well-being is probably not just expenditures, but what are the things that they have or do not have. And even within this, we could perhaps break this down into objective and subjective indicators. So objective things would be, yeah, whether you have a heat pump, AC, or how much food have you consumed and how many miles have you driven and things like that. And subjective indicators would be just feeling cold, or you're skipping meals, or you're avoiding travel just because for whatever reason. And again, you could just directly look at the relationship of these indicators to well-being and just completely avoid going through the consumption route. But again, one could argue that at the end of the day, what people spend is, dollar amounts, and we should probably be looking at that. So there's different schools of thought and how you would approach this. And a completely different way about thinking about this is looking at emission factors. So you take the consumption categories, convert them into either energy intensities or tons of CO2, and then again, you could see how that's linked to well-being as well. So yeah, so this is sort of the broad framework we are working with. And I'll just give you a quick example of how we do this analysis. Let's say if we're just looking at subjective indicators and how that is contributing to our well-being or not. So here, yeah, I'm just asking the question, does facing any sort of subjective insecurity, does it lower your life satisfaction or not? And here on the y-axis, what is shown is difference between people who face an insecurity and people who have not faced an insecurity, and particularly looking at energy. So what this is telling us is, on average, there's a minus 0.6 difference between people facing energy insecurity and not facing energy insecurity. And just to put that in dollar amounts, that would be worth perhaps about $25,000 worth of annual household income. And we could do a similar exercise for a bunch of different insecurities as well. So here we just have food, housing, and travel, and we see, yeah, facing any type of insecurity does lower your life satisfaction. And we could go one step ahead and we could actually score all of these. So what we did is you just assign them a score of 1 or 0 on whether you've experienced an insecurity or not. So having a score of 4 would mean that you've experienced all of these, and having a score of 0 would mean that you have not experienced any of these insecurities. And then if you were to just map these life satisfaction scores for these 4 different groups as a function of total expenditures, we see this very interesting trend. So I'll just, let's say, follow the score of 0. So that's the topmost one. So these would be households that have not experienced any insecurity. So the life satisfaction increases with, the more money you spend. And I mean, same as the trend. Adam, your question?
Oh, sorry. I can wait. I finish your thought. I'm sorry. Oh.
All right. Okay. So all of them increase, but the most interesting part is none of these curves touch each other. So what does that mean? So for example, let's say you're in the 20th percentile for expenditure. Regardless of how much money you spend, you're never going to have the same life satisfaction as any of the higher groups. So there might be factors other than just spending that might take you from one group to another, but just spending more might not compensate for the insecurities that you're feeling, your household is feeling. Yes, Adam.
Yeah. First off, really incredible work that touches on a lot of things that I've worked on. I'm going to try to be very focused because it's a little bit hard because I'm thinking about 1,000 things. I'm wondering with what you're showing on this slide, if there's a way to compare within household change, or at least simulate within household change, because, as you're probably aware, there's a lot of cross-sectional work, which is fine and includes several of my, own humble contributions that looks at the effect of, say, energy and security on different indicators of well-being. But, there's a lot less work that says, here's a household that was either energy insecure and then became energy secure, here's how their well-being changed, or vice versa.
Mhm.
And I didn't know with the data that you would gather if it would be possible to answer that, or either simulate an answer to that kind of within household change, and it may be a better way that we can get with just cross-sectional surveys, if that makes any sense.
Just curious as to what you mean by within household changes.
Well, so if you have cross-sectional data, right? If you have data that's just all gathered at one point in time, you don't necessarily know. I mean, it's hard to make a causal claim that this household experiences, say, energy insecurity, therefore they report, lower happiness or lower subjective well-being in some way. But it'd be really neat if you could follow homes over time and show this home and improve their energy insecurity, this household, I should say, and then therefore we can see these well-being changes also. Or maybe this household, not that you'd want to do this as an intervention, but maybe it happens organically. This household becomes food insecure. Oh no, look, their well-being indicators also decline. I think there's a lot. My impression is, and again, I am energy insecurity, I know fairly well. The other types of insecurity, not as well. But my impression is, at least in the domain of energy insecurity, there's a lot of that cross-sectional work where you can compare an energy insecure household to one that's energy secure. But it'd be really neat to, over time, to be able to follow households, or at least simulate. And you guys are really good at thinking of novel ways to use survey data. At least simulate sorry, it's my going overhead. At least simulate something akin to like a panel data. I think that'd be or if you can do it by some of the fusion techniques you're using with multiple surveys, that'd be a pretty major contribution of literature. And a really neat thing if we could show that energy efficiency improvements led to meaningful changes in well-being. Even if they're fairly incremental, any changes is good. So that's kind of what I was getting at. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, we do have, surveys from different years, but there's no real longitudinal data. So yeah, as Narsima said in the chat, AHS is, tracks the same house over years. So there is a way to look at that, but Gallup, for example, it's, completely randomized. So there's no way to track a particular household. Another way we are thinking about causal effects is doing like a propensity score matching. So, and then you could do, treatment effect and see if, the treatment of insecurity, does it contribute towards life satisfaction or not. So that's a way to directly get at it. But yeah, your point taken. There are perhaps hacky ways to do it, like for example, Rex 2015. But again, that we'd have to do that at an aggregated level and not at a household level, right? So yeah. Okay, yeah, so that's all I have. This is just an example of one of the questions that we're thinking about, but yeah, there's a lot to dig into the data and understand a bunch of correlations and a lot of analysis to be done. So I'll just stop here. So just thinking about what else can we do with this platform and these methods is one, we're looking at including more surveys into this conversation. And one big one is the time use survey. And another analysis that we could do is also just looking at things that happen outside the house. So for example, here, there's a food insecurity map. And on top of that, I've just thrown in a bunch of grocery store locations. And you can think about questions like, does the presence of a store really contribute towards food insecurity or not? So there's a lot of other applications in similar vein with, either public transportation, air pollution, all of them can sort of be roped in. So, yeah, and that's it. And thanks to Narsima and Kevin. I think we've had like so many discussions and so much brainstorming, and then Tammy as well with all our Tuesday meetings. So it's been really useful. Yes, it's a question.
Yeah, Karthik, I think, I had a couple questions from a few slides before about what you were just saying about applications using other data sets like grocery stores or air pollution, that example on the right.
Mhm.
I think for me, this is my unfamiliarity with the field, so maybe these are somewhat naive questions. Back to the point about how much variability is explained in life satisfaction.
Mhm.
I understood your point about potentially, just putting in lots of variables and inflating that number, but another way to think about it, like if someone's goal were to try to account for as many factors as possible, have people done that where they've introduced variables that I don't know what to say. I feel dumb, but they just put in everything that could possibly matter. Obviously, there's a lot of
Mhm.
collinearity there, so maybe that's one of the limitations.
Sure.
But how much more can life satisfaction be explained if you do put in a lot of variables?
I mean, most studies do put in a lot more, so usually include, whether you're married or not, whether you have a job, children, house sizes, race, all of them usually go into the controls. And even with all of those, I'd see the best I've seen is maybe 0.4, 0.5 tops, the R-squared values. And then within that, the coefficient for expenditure or income would be 0.3, 0.4.
Okay.
So that's probably the highest I've seen from the literature.
Okay, that helps. I think another question that I had, if I may, is I didn't really understand the use of emissions on that slide where you had like other metrics that could be used. It showed up as the last like block of text in the upper left-hand quadrant.
Sure.
It,
Mhm.
I'm curious what the arrow was drawn towards eudaimonic, or is it maybe just drawn towards subjective well-being?
Just well-being in general. And yeah, I could just talk about that a little more. The
Yeah,
way I
sure.
think about that is by the end of, if we were to do that study, maybe by the end of it, we'd be like, oh, there's certain activities that improve life satisfaction, but don't have to be carbon intensive. Maybe there's certain lifestyles that we could identify which would increase well-being, but not at the cost of increased CO2 emissions. So that would be sort of the hypothesis or the thinking around understanding those relationships.
Okay, so maybe like in the example that you gave with energy intensity, you could change that out to carbon emission or carbon dioxide emissions intensity, and then think about mapping activities that improve well-being but are low intensity with respect
Correct.
to carbon dioxide.
Correct.
Okay, I think I understand better what you were trying to get at here. So thank you. I think Adam just raised his hand.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, to that point, and sorry if this is something of a divergence, because like I said, I'm thinking about 1,000 different things. There is, as you've probably seen in your search, that pretty large literature on energy efficient well-being or ecologically efficient well-being or carbon efficient well-being. I mean, it's kind of a similar concept in a couple of different ways, but my sense is that most of that literature is done with fairly coarse macro level indicators at the national scale. I think maybe I've seen one analysis at the state level in the US. And this is after not looking for a few years, so it may have gotten better. So, you might be able to extend that work. Another direction to go with this, perhaps as a follow-up paper, would be extend some of that work at the household scale too.
Right.
The sort of household energy efficiency or carbon efficiency of well-being.
I think, yeah, there's very few household level papers. And one of the earlier examples from literature that was an household level, although they're slightly coarse income groups, but I think it is worth exploring. But the only thing is it takes away from the household, because I'm guessing people don't think about, maybe some people do think about emissions, but usually I don't know if that's the point of view that households take when spending money, but it is part of the narrative. But yeah, I don't know if that's how decisions are made.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody about Simba's suggestion. I don't know if everybody got that, but to each person was going to get to ask a question. So I suggest we open it up to people who are less forthcoming. Don't immediately raise their hand. And we
My
have a chicken
question
and
is
egg
so
problem, right?
sorry. Yeah, my question was somewhat addressed already, but I was just curious if you noticed in the data that you've looked at whether there have been any notable changes in patterns that you've seen over time.
Yeah, I don't think we've really done much. Well, from a well-being perspective, well, the sad news is that well-being on average doesn't change. So if you looked at life satisfaction scores in the past decade, just in the US, it is pretty flat. Again, I cannot talk about household level changes because we don't have the data to look at that, but on average, this is pretty well known that life satisfaction scores, don't change, because the argument behind that is you're always comparing yourself to other people. So even if you make more money or anything changes, you're just comparing yourself to somebody higher than you, and you're always stuck in this like a hedonic treadmill where nothing changes for you. So for life satisfaction, that is the case. But for other metrics, I haven't really gotten a chance to compare across years. I don't know, Nassima, if you have anything to add to that, perhaps, I don't know, maybe the heat pump adoption rate has gone up or something like that, but I haven't specifically compared, for example, Rex 2015 to Rex 2020 to see what has exactly changed.
Well, just in terms of well-being, I'm just remembering your graphs from the stress paper. I thought you did see marginal improvements over time, but I think it's a small order of magnitude. It's like decimal place changes, but it's systematic though, it seems, right?
Changes, and what usually we see a big change, for example, between 2008 and 2009, like after the economic recession. So usually life satisfaction follows the economic state of the country for most part. So you'll see, even if you look at the past 40 years worth of data across the world, it sort of follows, economic booms and busts. So that's the current understanding about life satisfaction. But again, all of this, there's a lot of criticism because these are average numbers and don't follow a particular household. So average numbers don't change much, but we don't know what happens, for a person.
Others?
I'm not going to ask a question right now, but I feel like we could have an extended discussion about this just as a presentation space, and we included that in our in-person meeting. But I feel like this question of whether you framed it in terms of deprivation or consumption, or now that we have all these data to talk about, I feel like it's worth a longer discussion, not just what is the real thing? Or what relationships do we know about? But how are we going to use this in the project? Or can we use it? Or should we use it? So I feel like all of that needs to get together. We need like 3 hours.
Well, I mean, along those lines, I wanted to ask all of you kind of, well, no, I'll hold that. And why don't you ask your question?
I was gonna wait till the last second and then yield all my time to other people and, use the clock as an excuse, but, so curious, did you, you said on Tuesday that the Rex 2020 data is a lot larger data set?
Mhm.
Am I making that up? Yeah. So were you able to come up with any meaningful information out of that expanded set, or is there more categories on it? Like what's sort of the big difference there?
Right. So, well, the big difference is the size, and the variables are more or less the same. You haven't done an exact comparison, but in terms of processing them, I didn't find any major differences. So I would say, yeah, we don't have, any new things in there other than it being better, as we saw in the validation results. So we have more confidence in our fused variables. So that is for sure.
But you don't
Karthik?
foresee any different conclusions
Uh,
or different hypotheses?
well, yeah, I don't think I've gotten to the conclusions part yet because, we haven't really done a systematic analysis between the both. Like in terms of the validation exercises, both of them look sort of similar because in 2015 as well, we had found, reasonable correlation between external data and our data, and same is the case with 2020. But in terms of the specific analysis, I think I'll have to dig in to see, for example, if the insecurity contribution is, how different is that between 2015 and 2020? That is something I could do, but I haven't gotten into that part yet.
I have a quick question, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping too quickly. I don't have the overall understanding about everything, but Karthik, thank you for the excellent presentations. I'm thinking about like if it will be too much to ask to kind of like a lower and upper limit as to capture the temporal variation of this different characterization. Like you are considering 2015, 2020 data set. Is there any way or idea to have those variation in terms of actual value?
You mean the years 2015 and 20?
Yeah, like you're considering 15 and 20, but if we want to think about a more broad year characterization, is there any way to capture that temporal variation?
Sure. So in theory, we could do any year. So the American Community Survey happens every year, but what we are limited by is these other specialized surveys. So like the Rex survey first, the most recent one is 2020, but the one before that is 2015. So we are sort of limited by that. So some surveys are better than others. For example, the housing survey happens every 2 years. So that, you could potentially do 2015, 17, 19, I think. And similarly, each survey has its own time frame.
Yeah, okay.
So that is what we are limited by. And then we're also limited by just the labor that goes into it, because you need to understand each survey really carefully, do the initial processing, matching. So there is significant amount of work that goes into that as well. So it's a combination of both the survey being present and then our ability to process them quickly as well.
Okay, thank you.
Karthik, In the interest of wrapping up on time, I know there are a few people that have to jump off. I always hate to bring these things to a close, but I'd like to just close us here, and it's short turnaround. I think next week I'm supposed to lead a discussion. I think based on what Tammy said, I'm sort of in agreement that there's more that we could talk about here. So I'll be thinking about how to maybe make that conversation flow. I'm just not sure I'll have time to send you and Narasimha my thoughts and get feedback and make it as coherent as I'd like, but I might try. So thanks for a great presentation and conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Yeah, this is really useful. Yeah, and yeah, I think Narasimha was saying something before he got cut off. Did you want to?
Well, I think Edison kind of wrapped it up. I just wanted to prompt everyone to think about exactly that question, is that Tammy had raised as well. You know, the point is, I think at different scales, we're asking the same questions. And the whole point of this analysis is what can we draw from existing data and with how much comfort. There is power in large numbers. But I just would be useful to reflect on how the question maybe is differently framed. How did you think about it differently from what we're asking? Because a lot of this is constrained by what's available in terms of data. But I think it'd be really useful to illuminate how the scale differences and the different research approaches changes the nature of the question we're asking. And it'll be really instructive in terms of just our epistemology of doing convergence research to actually make that explicit and document it. And we should do that in this project. I think that itself is really useful. So I would encourage Edison, your line of thinking to encourage that discussion among us, but actually make it more formal to document those differences. And even Adam's questions are right on point. What's missing in the literature, how should we structure future research, etc. Like doing actual panels, on well-being, for example. Anyway, thanks. That's really useful, all of this.
Thank you, Narasimha.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. And then the slides are on the Google Drive. So if you want, you can take a look.
Okay, thank you. Bye.